It was a typical East End fog. It wasn't white. Like all true Londoners, and despite what he saw at the flicks, Cranfield knew the fog was green. It was a damp, tubercular, reassuring shade. For years the night sky had glowed livid pink, shot through with dust and flame, though that was fading now. With time, the tiny clumps of black or red flowers that bloomed on the rubble would die out. Cranfield was a young man. He hoped to be pounding this beat 20, 30 years on. His father had walked these streets when the first tentative bombs fell. His great-uncle had hunted the Ripper and the Limehouse Phantom nearby. He was walking in their footsteps, and in the labyrinth of fogs he could almost believe their paths would cross. 3 generations of policemen at the same crossroads. There came the peal of a bell from Shoreditch. Hairs prickled on the back of his neck, a memory of sirens and all-clear whistles, and the chime calling all hands to help pull bodies from the river. His beat took him past Spitalfields Market, which was shut up for the night, though the gate still thronged with people. The church opposite attracted them like doodlebugs. It was bone white, yellowed with neglect, then scorched black by a Luftwaffe handprint that might not fade for generations. To one side there was a scrub of grass where vagrants slept under newsprint blankets, though Cranfield couldn't imagine the dreams the church would give them. By day, when the streets filled with human heat, old women would sit on the steps beneath the angular spire and suck green oranges and spit the pips onto the street to mock austerity. Cranfield felt great sympathy for them, the living public. By night the stones absorbed all the heat and the people stayed huddled round the pub doorways till closing time, then at the market gate. Ragged around the gate were the dark facades of houses, pitted with gaps where other homes had stood, until one night they had been transformed into cairns of brick rubble and human pulp. Outside the market a woman was singing, a broken voice. Eerily, Cranfield couldn't see where it was coming from. They were mainly women here, in their clusters. Vagrants stood shivering by a fire on the scrub. A dirt-faced boy ran in the street, grinning, slipped past Cranfield, and the policeman instinctively felt like lashing out, but checked himself. There was a woman squatting on the steps, older than she looked, wrapped in a dark shawl but bareheaded. She sold flowers by day, and had a flower's name, but he couldn't place it right now. There was an old soldier beside her, tall and heavy in his black cap and coat. He turned to look at Cranfield with a long, dead slab face that probably hadn't twitched since 1918. Cranfield tipped the rim of his hat and nodded automatically. But the eye that watched him was white and sightless. He moved through them, watching them bristle as he passed. Overhead was a shiny bomber's moon. They could all feel it despite the fog. There was a patch of darkness on the far side of the church. The girl came stumbling out of that. A splash of violent pink in the midst of green. Cranfield wasn't the first to see her. It was the commotion that made him turn, but he was the closest, and when she lost her footing, he was there to catch her. A few days later, he would barely remember what she looked like. There was just the memory of her as she shambled towards him, taking each step as though it were her first, wearing nothing but a baggy, pink pair of pyjamas, not silk, not cotton, not even nylon, just pink and shiny in the moonlight. She was barefoot, her feet were blue. The pink pyjamas hung crumpled on her wiry frame. She was small enough for Cranfield to mistake her for a child, though once he got close, he realised she was probably in her 20s. She was a skinny, pale thing. She shivered in the autumn fog, but she looked hurt rather than cold. Her eyes told him that they had a grey, traumatised sheen. Witness eyes. He could tell just by looking that her grasp on the everyday had been ripped away, and savagely. It had been over 4 years since Cranfield held anyone like this. Then it had been a girl no older than 12, and he cradled her in his arms as the life left her body. You heard stories of Blitz miracles all the time, unlikely survivors, but he'd never seen one with his own eyes. This woman wasn't going to die. Her stare leapt wildly round the faces of the gathered crowd. He could feel delicate bones through her pyjamas. What's happened to you?" he asked. She was smiling. He tried a more basic approach. "What's your name?" "I don't remember," she said. "What year is this? I don't remember the year." Someone mumbled it, embarrassed. The girl nodded and grinned. It was hard to tell if she understood the date. Cranfield thought shell shock, though that made no sense. She had a blitz twitch. There were no signs of violence on her face, on her clothes. I don't know who I am." Her eyes opened wider, and she grabbed his uniform frantically. "Police!" she said, and again he knew she was a victim. "Are you hurt?" "I remember. Light," she insisted. "I was going to die. There was so much light." She held open palms out for Cranfield to inspect, as if she'd been clutching light in them, but her hands were just dark, bruised pink. A chill rippled through him anyway. Someone else was kneeling beside him, the flower seller, holding out a worn-out bloom, so blackened it was impossible to tell what it had ever been. The girl took it mutely, keeping her mouth tight shut as if holding back a scream. Then her eyes closed, and her head lolled back. But she was only asleep. The girl in pink pyjamas. The police never found a name for her, and the press didn't need one. She became a celebrity, and her fame spread wide, though not far beyond London. Briefly, she captured the public imagination. All the melodramatic ingredients were there: the pretty girl, the sinister East End setting, a crime so terrible she had wiped it from her mind. Even the pink pyjamas added a frisson that helped sell papers. The girl in pink pyjamas. She was a distraction for dangerous times. She took up the front pages and kept the frightening business of the day folded within. You could look at her photograph and forget rationing and devaluation, Pakistan and Palestine, airlifts and fuel crises, China and Germany, the FBI and the MGB, and the silent dust clouds rising over Kazakhstan. She always looked damaged in the photographs, the authentic face of 1949. So she was pinned through the middle of the 20th century. All of London knew who she was, even if she didn't. The girl in pink pyjamas. Eventually her celebrity waned and she was gradually forgotten. After a few days, once the novelty had worn off and the police had turned up no new leads, she began to vanish from the newspapers. But by then, she had come to his attention. But perhaps he already knew. Each morning, after midnight, a woman stood in the street beneath Honoré Le Chasseur's window and screamed abuse at the bloody bastard Irish who had taken her son away. That was several wars ago, but sitting alone in the dark, Le Chasseur could see the bullet going through her dead son's skull. Le Chasseur rarely slept, but spent his nights drinking whiskey, sometimes vodka. He'd lost the capacity to get drunk in 1944 and took alcohol as an anaesthetic. His dreams brought forth monsters. They always had done. But London seemed to amplify them. Cheap whiskey was easy to find for someone with the right contacts, though Le Chasseur was beginning to suspect that his were wrong. Recently he had taken a consignment of meat from a reliable source. It had been a bad deal. The meat was rancid, almost green, crawling with maggots. He had wrapped a slab of the rotten meat in newspaper. The paper carried a report and a picture of a pretty, dazed-looking woman posing uneasily in light grey pyjamas. The image caught his eye, as sometimes important things would, but he decided it was just a sympathetic reaction. She looked out of place, another exile in London. The grainy picture rubbed off on his hands. Rationing would last a little longer. After that, the future was up for grabs. He dreamed of the future sometimes, of a hybrid London whose familiar skyline had been fused with towers of glass and steel. He sat cross-legged on his bed, dreaming with his eyes open. He'd had vivid dreams as a boy. Once he twitched and fitted on a street corner, while in his mind he was out on the bayou, fighting a muck-encrusted gold-eyed swamp monster. That was rare. Nothing to worry the conscription board. Then he was blasted through a Belgian farmhouse window, and the dreams became sharper. Sometimes they came true, and sometimes they didn't. That morning he'd managed to sleep a little and have ordinary dreams, and the first thing he said to himself when he woke was, "Doctor." But he didn't take it to mean anything. Around him, his apartment was Spartan and undecorated. He liked the clean bareness of the room, the raw plaster walls, the exposed plumbing, the pale brown wood of the floorboards. Sometimes he was forced to stow contraband here, most recently silk underwear and Russian cigarettes. He'd piled them in a corner, but still bristled at the clutter they represented. The most important things he carried in his head. He let few people in. This was his private space. He washed and dressed and inspected himself in the bathroom mirror. He'd let his hair grow since the army, neatly and down to his shoulders, and was cultivating a thin black beard and moustache. The black was shot through with premature lines of grey. He was already a distinctive figure in this neighbourhood, a colourful exotic with a slow, charismatic smile and coffee-dark skin. There were disadvantages, but sometimes it helped to be hidden in plain sight. His reflection stared back at him, hypnotically. He had prominent eyes, icy white with deep brown pupils. He practised a rogue's grin. He practised a big, confident stare. He brushed his teeth, mouthing phrases in a bad English accent. "Splendid! I beg your pardon. Good show." His mouth was a slash on his face, frothing with smuggled American toothpaste. He never slept, but he always felt good in the mornings. Something in the unrationed daylight of London made him feel free. The one thing Leschasaw knew he would never adjust to was the winter. It was always so cold here. Even in summer the temperature couldn't touch the coldest New Orleans day. He pulled on his black leather winter coat before leaving. He'd also taken to wearing a hat, not so much because of the cold, but because it kept the dreams trapped in his head. "You look like a gangster," he told the reflection. He'd been moved to England in 1943, posted to a foreign land where everyone from the lowliest private to the highest-ranking blimp believed that all America was Chicago and Al Capone was her honorary president. After the war, he decided that was true. "I like being a gangster. I like being an American in London." In 1944, he'd been told he would never walk again. He bounded out of the room and ran down the stairs. His landlady was standing halfway down, old Mrs. Bag-of-Bones, with her knitted shawl and her patient smile that she wore only for the strange, polite, black foreign gentleman in the attic. He caught the banisters, set them creaking before he could bowl into her. "How good morning, Mr. L, you're full of beans today." Like so many Londoners, his landlady couldn't quite get her tongue round his name, so he became Mr. L. It all added to the lustre. "I always am," he said as he edged past, "and I got an appointment." She called after him, "There were men asking after you again last night. I told them you weren't here." "Were they the police?" he asked, not turning. "Oh, I shouldn't think so. They was very rough men, ugly with big hands." "Ah, you had me worried there. They sound like old friends," he said, mainly to assuage her fears. He knew a great many ugly men with big hands, but he liked to keep them away from his home. Sometimes he felt a wanderlust and imagined a life half on the run, sleeping where and when he could, but the simple pleasure of having a fixed place of his own always outweighed that. Besides, he liked Mrs. Bag-of-Bones. On quiet evenings they talked together in her kitchen, exchanging war stories, while she taught him how to enjoy tea. She'd lost a son in the Spanish Civil War. Like so many, she was followed wherever she went by the faceless dead. London was haunted. She masked her eyes with pebble-thick glasses to avoid seeing them. If he was troubled by the thought of night visitors, Lechasseur felt happier once he'd got out into the bitter air and onto his bike. He travelled everywhere he could by bicycle. He felt more connected with his surroundings than he would be in an automobile, and it was exhilarating to feel the rhythm of his legs as he pedalled. After the blast had shredded his spine, he'd had to relearn the art of walking. It had come to him surprisingly quickly, and he always felt that he'd somehow embarrassed the US Army by trumping their predictions.